I-V-M.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of Marbles Lost and Found. I'm Avanti.
And I'm Zain.
And today we have Gitanjali Palekar, who is a child and adolescent therapist. And we're talking today about mental health issues in children, because a lot of us have this misconception that mental health issues really only happen to adults, because children are untroubled and carefree and otherwise they're just badly behaved.
Yes, exactly. They're just badly behaved kids, yes. So you know what? I think rather than getting to a very specific question, let's set the scene and let's set the record straight once and for all. What is your take on that opinion in the first place?
To begin with, hi guys.
Hi, yes.
So my opinion on whether there is mental health for children?
Yeah, or more of just like if a child is behaving in what is considered a quote-unquote badly behaved way, he or she is just a badly behaved child, full stop.
Okay. So I think in our school systems, we rush to identify children who are perhaps not being well behaved because that interferes with the structure that the school sets up. Mm-hmm. But essentially, very little attention is paid to the emotional well-being of children. So when you say mental health, let's first try to understand what the definition means. Mm-hmm. Definition is primarily psychological, emotional, social well-being. Academic doesn't really figure in it immediately. Right. Yeah. So I think, the badly behaved child is identified by someone who doesn't fit the framework that a school or a family structure establishes.
Right.
But very little attention is paid to why a child may be misbehaving. And is it really misbehaving? Because I, as someone who works with children, primarily feel that anything a child does is essentially them communicating to us. Right. There's a message in what they're trying to
And just so our listeners know, the children that you normally work with are between what ages, roughly?
So I do therapy with children from the ages of 2 up till late teens.
Okay.
And that surprises a lot of people. The first question I have is, does a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old need therapy? But that will surprise us, because they do. Because children, regardless of what age they are, they're human, they're individual, they have their own sense of self, they have their thoughts, they have their emotions. Right. So why do we deny or ignore the fact that emotionally they can be affected by something in their life as well?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because do we just grow up, suddenly become an adult and suddenly have emotions and difficulties in coping with them? Mm-hmm. There's a very big component that we seem to ignore. If we have difficulties in our early 20s, let's say, where do they stem from? If we know how to cope very effectively with a challenging situation, where does that come from? From our childhood. Because just like we had to learn our algebra when we were in the 5th grade to get better and do calculus when we reach college, we've had to learn something in our childhood when it comes to emotions so that we can efficiently make use of that when we enter adulthood.
Right.
So that is one of the major components I feel is ignored by people, who manage them, like the school, the families, the society at large.
So to that end, when do parents typically come to you then? Or is
at
it...
what stage of the stress?
Or at what stage? Is it because,
in
fact, and is it possibly to do with, strictly to do with their child's behavior, or does it also have to do with their behavior with the child?
I mean, parenting is where it's at.
Parents.
You want to get into that?
I'd love to. So what I have seen, there's a trend, right? Majority, 90% of the time, and I know 90 is just my assumption, a parent or a school will refer a child because he's not doing well academically. Mm-hmm. The first complaint is, he's not doing work at school, she's not studying enough, she's not doing her homework, she's high potential, but her grades have fallen. I want them to do better. That's often the reason why they come to a therapist seeking help. And also, yes, the second, then as you discuss with them, the second thing that will come up is they don't listen to us. Mm-hmm. So it seems like, society tends to see children as these products who have to kind of be shaped as per the adult expectation.
Right.
And I feel academics is the last concern when it comes to a child's mental health. Because if my mind is chaotic, if I'm emotionally not feeling well,
and if my life is chaotic.
If my life is chaotic, my emotional well-being is really not top-notch. And there's a lot of chaos in my head. My internal state of mind is chaotic. I will not have headspace to bother about what the teacher is teaching in class. I will not bother about, I won't find any motivation or a sense of achievement to do better or more with my academics.
So how do you get to a point where you are able to communicate with these kids, or they're able to communicate with you in whatever way, tell you that, you know what, this is what's bothering me? How do they express themselves with you?
So it depends from age to age, right? So of course, if I'm seeing a child who's about 2, 3 till about 6, they're not very verbal. So with them, the medium is primarily play. So in play therapy, what happens is a child will engage in play, and my role as a therapist is to just observe the play that they're doing. So I don't engage with them directly. I don't take part in the play unless they invite me to. And I don't talk about the play. So when I'm in session, I have some background information, history about the child. I understand how he or she may be behaving in the school or at home and what is problematic. So now so I have that background information. I also have an understanding that why it could be problematic based on, what inputs I have got from the parents. So when they are engaged in play, they are essentially playing out their internal state of mind. Play helps them bring the unconscious out into the conscious.
Okay.
And I'm there to make sense of it and interpret it back to them. So when I interpret it back to them, I'm essentially communicating what they are communicating to me. And it's not something they're very aware of. They can't, if I were to say it, they might not understand it, but they also at an unconscious level understand what's happening.
Right. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So, for example, children will, if they are going through something, for example, there's a kid, he is facing some challenge, like a moral challenge where suppose children are bullying him. He doesn't like it. He tells no, but he also feels they should not be doing this. So once he's not necessarily reacting to them, but he also feels a sense of injustice where someone is getting away with bad behavior. And this child is 6, let's say, right? He comes into session and he spends his entire session and the next 2 sessions actually playing with Legos, where Legos become this big mountain heap and there's a truck which just keeps ramming into it.
Right, okay.
Now, since I know his history, I've been working with him for a while, I know that this is his way of showing the the challenge that's in front of him, that he's not able to overcome. The injustice he feels at being bullied and his struggle in his inability to kind of assert himself. And I kind of reflect on that.
Right.
And he might not respond to what I am reflecting, but his play changes according to that. Okay. And I stay with him. I keep interpreting different play that he's doing. Okay, now the truck is doing this. The truck is helping this other truck. So a lot of that kind of movement is happening. And so this particular child, then after 1 session, 2 sessions, depending on how long he needs to work through this internal dilemma for himself, will stop with this play. And I know when he stops with this play, he's resolved it for himself.
Right.
So I'm just a facilitator. I'm not being directive. I'm not being suggestive. I'm not telling him right from wrong. I'm not telling him how to fix his life.
Right.
I'm actually just supporting him, being there for him, providing him the support to overcome his own challenges. Because that's what therapy does. It creates a space where I can take away the mental chaos by reflecting it back to them, creating headspace for them to problem solve their own life situations.
So then when you are able to process these situations, how do you then relay that to the parents? I presume there may be situations where a parent turns around and says, no, not my child, and stuff like that. And I know of plenty of therapists, in fact, if I may say so, Avanti, yourself included, where you've had younger clients, but they had to stop therapy because their parents didn't know. And they turned around and said, my child doesn't need therapy.
I'm glad you asked me that question. Can I just interject?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So in my practice, I've found one very interesting pattern. Children who have stayed in therapy are essentially children who have agency. Parents recognizing that the child has agency. Now, what is agency? Agency essentially means that I'm an individual. I have my own thoughts, feelings, emotions, capacity to have opinions.
Agency was not a word when we were growing up in the 90s.
No, definitely not.
What is agency?
Individual wasn't a word.
Exactly, yeah. Go play with the other kids. What's wrong with you? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of Indian parents primarily feel that a child who's 2, who's 3, who's 5 need not have agency. They are dependent on us. They need us for support and safety. So automatically I need to call the shots in everything that they do. Not recognizing there's emotional agency as well. You are responsible for your child. But the emotional agency is something they discount. And what I've found is parents who recognize that my child has that agency and give it to them, those children stay in therapy through the entire process.
And just to clarify that, does agency look like, okay, I'm going to be there for my child. I'm going to, give them the guidance and support or whatever. I'm going to direct them in certain ways. But I'm also going to recognize that they don't have to follow everything and they can throw a tantrum and they can be unhappy about something that I want them to be happy about.
Exactly. It's the acknowledgement of the fact that they are unhappy, that they're throwing a tantrum.
Yeah.
Giving agency acknowledgement does not mean that I accept or condone my child's misbehavior. A lot of parents confuse it with that. I've been asked questions, does that mean I have to allow them whatever they want? No. I'll give an example for agency, right? You take a child for one of the superhero movies, you step out and ask your child, hey, how did you find the movie? And the child says, I didn't think it was really that great. And the parent goes, what? You've been eating my brains for a month wanting to go for this movie and you didn't even like it? I bought the tickets before. What do you think the child understood from this?
Right.
I have to like everything that my parents...
It doesn't matter what my opinion is.
Yes.
I was meant to like it. But a parent who recognizes that their child has agency would have said, that's interesting. I like the movie, but even though you are a bigger fan for this superhero, you didn't think it was great. Interesting.
It's amazing how that example of the former dynamic that you gave just pertains to real life relationships in adulthood and well beyond. Hey, I did all of this. Why aren't you like, oh my God, you can just think of a number of different contexts in which that applies, It's incredible.
So a lot of children are discontinued who needed therapy. And, I think at whatever age they come in, if not earlier, is the right time because we have scope of, working with them and possibly even preventing adverse effects being played out when they reach adulthood. But unfortunately, you can't force someone to stay in therapy and no matter what you say. So what I've found is that parents, even though a child needs therapy, they will not recognize the need because there's another aspect of it that I would like to talk about as to how parents pay attention to the emotionality of a child. Now, if I've not given them agency, I don't recognize that they have agency. The second aspect is if I just see them as an extension of me, right? They just have to follow through or do what I expect as an adult. The old dicta that children must be seen, not heard. So that philosophy to a large extent. So if a child does well in an exam, it's a reflection on me as a parent. Child wins a gold medal. Hey, I'm the parent.
Right.
So in that dynamic, I may not pay attention to what my child is feeling.
You're making your child's achievements about you.
Yes.
And vice versa. You're making your child's
failures
about you.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's got to impact the dynamic itself, as well. Because if you're feeling resentment towards a child for failing, they're going to sense it.
Yeah.
Yes. And what happens in such a scenario as well is the child recognizes, unconsciously of course, that my emotions or my emotional needs are secondary to the parent.
Right.
So they grow up believing that their needs or emotions are not important enough. And this child will turn into an adult who would basically not assert themselves, be in situations where they will not have boundaries to kind of just protect their own emotional needs or just be self-critical about themselves. If I may give an example.
Yes, please.
You have an adult, let's say he's an investment banker, doing well for himself, has a family, married, all of that. But he's unhappy. He is very self-critical about himself. He's very critical about his children's achievements. The wife is unhappy because there is no emotional connection. She's like, nothing makes him happy. He goes into therapy and in due course, there are a lot of, childhood memories being spoken about. And there's this one particular memory that he recounts to his therapist, that I was a student who would always get 90-95% in my exams. In my 10th board, I got an 82. My parent was very upset with me. He said, this is unacceptable. How could you do this? You must be ashamed, just as I'm ashamed of you. There is no excusing this, right? Very regular reaction from a parent, when a child hasn't done well. So the same thing this guy thought, hey, actually my parent was justified. I didn't really do well. I deserved the scolding I got. What the parent missed was essentially an opportunity for emotional learning that speaks to another approach that I kind of work with my parents in explaining is emotional attunement.
Okay.
Now, if the parent was emotionally attuned, after having recognized that there's agency, would have taught something to the child that they can use in their future, right? The first thing is saying instead, hey, this is disappointing. I'm sure even you're disappointed. But let's look at what happened this year. Why did we get so less marks? And can we remedy it for the next time? Because it is one exam.
Right.
It doesn't have to be every exam.
Correct.
What the parent did in this situation was acknowledge what the child may be feeling, the emotions, reflected it back to them, acknowledge their own feelings here, were observant enough to perhaps recognize what has been going on in the child's life, that that's why they did not attain the desired marks, understood what their capabilities, the child's cognitive ability is, knows that the child is capable of more, used these observations and then emotionally responded to the child, saying, hey, let's figure out what can be done next, right? So now the child has learning on how to deal with challenging situations. So he grows up to be someone who recognizes that he can be upset with himself for something, but also have a fair assessment of his capabilities, because he got a very accurate feedback when he was a child. And then he knows that I can work on it.
Right. And so the thought or the belief that I am a failure doesn't come up.
Exactly.
It's okay, I failed at something.
Exactly.
I can do something else. Yeah.
So that's emotional learning, that the foundation happens in early childhood. Imagine a house. If the foundation is weak, the house will get built and it'll have some structural damage, which you can't see. But when, there's like a really bad rainy storm or something, that's when things start falling down. It's the same with us. If our emotions aren't really looked into when we are children, we don't have a secure sense of who we are. Our emotional needs are not looked into. I'm going to grow up to be someone who's not really going to do well in challenging situations.
Yeah,
most probably.
And actually, I want to take away some of the stigma that I think, or not stigma, the feeling of, I think, self-blame that's coming up, or blame towards everyone's parents that listeners or even some of us might be feeling right now, which is like, oh, you really could have done better.
Yeah.
You could have responded to me with emotional appropriate, But I think, I guess what I'm saying is everyone goes through it. Like everyone's parents are kind of winging it and responding according to how they're feeling in their own life.
So here's the thing: emotional neglect in a child can happen in the most loving, good homes with the most good enough parents. We're not talking about extreme circumstances.
Right.
It can happen in any household. It could have happened in yours, mine, or yours.
Right.
It's just very generic in a way, but it still is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And self-awareness is something that parents can start with, of recognizing that, my child has agency and what they feel emotionally is something that needs to be looked into.
And do you feel that the trend now, giving children their agency, really not making their actions or inactions about the parents and whatnot, are you seeing a trend like that now, or is there a lot more ground to cover generally? And I guess I'm talking very specifically about the Indian urban context.
Of course. If I may be honest, I think I see a very marginal proportion of the population I work with where children have agency. And I don't mean that they are dismissive of their children or they're neglectful. They just perhaps don't recognize that this has any bearing on them.
Right. Yeah, I think even a very simple example that I remember seeing some time ago is, so I swim a lot as a way of exercise. And I remember there was this kid. So usually later in the mornings is when there's kids swimming lessons. And they're usually young. They not more than like 6 or 7 at the most. And there was this young boy who just didn't want to get into the pool. And he was really just not throwing a tantrum, but he was crying. He was saying no. He was screaming a little bit. He didn't want to go in. The dad saying, come on, don't be a baby. Just get into the water. We're not going to do this other thing if you don't do the swimming right now. And you realize, fine, one can call that tough love or harsh parenting, but then you don't understand what message you're actually giving the child,
So you're connecting it with what I said earlier. He may or may not be affected by it because every child is different.
Sure.
Some children are perhaps their coping mechanisms or internally how their worldview is a little different. But let's say this kid is someone who is a lot more emotional and perhaps he processes this in a way that my father doesn't care about how I'm feeling right now. I'm scared, and my father is not paying attention to that. He's saying I'm being a baby, so maybe something is wrong with me. Maybe I am being not strong enough, and I'm a failure for not having been able to do this.
Right.
But now my dad has also threatened in a way that if you don't do this, you don't get that.
Right.
So what he's also learning is approval is conditional.
Right.
That if I have to be a certain way to get approval.
Oof, I feel like there's so many things shooting through my head right now in this episode. Wow. Well, I kind of want to sum up this episode by just sort of asking, and I think we've also very clearly touched upon this, but as a sort of general message to parents or people who are thinking of becoming parents, what is the one sort of thing that you'd suggest they keep in mind when it comes to raising their kids more than anything?
Oh, that's a big question.
It's a very loaded question, I know.
That they're individuals, capable of feeling.
So, I think, even the work that I do with parents, what I essentially tell them is that even at infancy, the bond that you have with your child, the way the child feels their needs are being fulfilled will have an impacting result on their worldview and how emotionally secure they grow up to be.
I actually wanted to also ask, does it always have to be the parent? Or can it just be any caregiver? It could be a maid, it could be a grandparent.
Primarily be a caregiver. But unfortunate thing is, that the caregivers, the non-parents, aren't the most ideal replacements. Because as an infant or even as a toddler, my sense of self comes from my parents. And if I didn't have parents and I was with my grandparents, it would be a good enough substitute, but it would still also affect me to a large extent. But to have parents around and then be made to rely on other caregivers can negatively impact some children. Again, I'm not saying it's a perfect formula that if this is happening means you're emotionally dysfunctional when you grow up. Because a lot of traits are intrinsics a child is born with.
Right.
So coming back to the earlier question, let's call it the primary caregivers. So the kind of relationship a child has with their primary caregivers, the early emotional needs, how soon or well are they fulfilled? If the child feels secure about it, he feels, okay, this world is a trustworthy world and I can be myself because I'm being looked after.
Right.
So that's something that has a very big impact on how a child grows up. Of course, as Avanti said, agency. Recognize that they're the individuals. Recognize that they have their own will, they have their own emotions, opinions, that a 2-year-old will want to decide, what clothes to wear.
Yeah.
They want that choice. And yes, it looks...
And it's not just pink for girls and blue for boys.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And it might look like a tantrum, but essentially it is a tantrum because as the autonomy is growing...
Are you allowing it or not?
Yes. And the second thing is they don't have the cognitive ability yet.
Right.
So it turns into tantrum.
Right.
It looks like a tantrum to it, but essentially their brain is growing, but they also don't know how to use that. So that's where as an adult you step in. You give them options. You kind of be their guide.
Just because some of this is coming, I think some people may interpret some of this as, oh, are you just saying that I need to be super indulgent with my kid and give them everything they ask for?
Yeah.
And I think that I'd like you to speak a little bit about that if you
could.
could.
Where does one draw the line between shaping a child's personality and just allowing them to discover themselves or just give them free rein?
Of course. So, I think everything kind of ties in together. You have to recognize your child has agency. You have to be emotionally in tune with your child, where you recognize the feelings they have. You understand where they're coming from. You understand what their cognitive abilities, how much they can do, using that to respond to them. And the most important thing, limit setting.
Well, because I think, let's face it, you have to be the adult.
Yes,
you cannot be the child.
No. So it has to be these 3 points that are listed out. They have to work simultaneously. Because when you limit setting is essentially discipline, as they say, right?
Sure.
What things are allowed, not allowed. So those have to be very firm. They have to be consistent. The child needs to know if I break this limit, what happens. And also when limit setting has to follow natural consequences. Consequences that are a direct result of a behavior. Not like, if you don't swim, I don't give you ice cream in the
Right,
evening.
right.
There's absolutely no correlation. Here
Right,
the
correct.
child is just going to feel a grudge that I didn't get ice cream, you're
Correct.
a bad parent.
So the consequence of that is if you don't swim, you're not going to learn how to swim.
Yes.
So do you want that or do you not want that?
Exactly.
Right.
All your friends are in class, they are learning, you're going to be left out. It's that realization.
Right.
So again, to answer your question, so what happens is parents feel that toddler, very cute. You know, they don't understand. They don't have language. They want something. So they will, distract. I have this question. Can I use distraction as a way of calming them down? But that's the thing. They might not have verbal skills, which is audible. But by the age of 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, a child's vocabulary is in hundreds.
Okay.
800, if I'm not mistaken.
6 months?
Yes. That's the thing. Just because they're not verbalizing it doesn't mean they don't have the
recognize
capacity.
it.
Exactly.
Right.
So they might not be able to verbalize it, but you have to work with them. So you give them limits, you repeat limits, you are consistent in enforcing the limits. And if the limits are broken, there's an understanding of natural consequences. And that is executed or applied by the third aspect that I said, the emotional attunement. You recognize how the child is feeling. You describe it back to them. Then you state your own expectations. Mama said that Mama would like us to go to the park only in the evening. I would prefer that we don't go in the sun, right? I've stated my expectation as a parent. Then I give them options. Would you like to do something in the kitchen or would you like to paint? Right? We redirect them. We don't distract them. We redirect them.
Sounds so exhausting.
So now what happens? When I follow these steps, what I'm essentially doing is I am removing some of the emotional chaos he's feeling because he's been refused to go to the park. And I'm now giving him space to problem solve by giving choices.
Right.
This is a learning for the long term because when he's next in a situation similar like this, he will use these problem solving skills.
Yeah.
One of the crutches or traps parents fall into is trying to fix it for children. Fix it emotionally, do something that'll make them feel better quickly, or stop a bad behavior in the short term.
Correct. Corporal punishment, basically. As an example.
Even if they don't hit, they might do something like, if you make noise, I will lock you up.
Right.
A lot of
Whatever,
parents.
yeah.
Sounds horrible.
Yeah, so there are parents who do that. So both of these are in the short term, they don't really work.
Right.
So essentially just focus on your child's emotional needs, what they're feeling, reflect it back to them, state your own emotions, give options when you want compliance, and when there is no compliance, natural consequences.
Fantastic. And I think that actually kind of sums up a lot of the things that we wanted to talk about in this episode. This has actually been super insightful.
Thank you so much, Gitanjali. Child and adolescent therapist.
Most welcome, guys, and thanks for having me on.
Yes,
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm Zain.
I'm Avanti.
And we're Marbles Lost and Found. We'll see you soon.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if you enjoy listening to content on the IVM Podcast Network, let me tell you about a couple of things that you should check out this week. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Sanjay Sapre. He's the president at Franklin Templeton India. They discuss the 25-year journey of Franklin Templeton and the role of mutual funds. On Varta Lab, host Akash and Naveen are joined by rapper Onkar Pujari, who goes by the stage name Yeda Anna. The three of them talk about Onkar's journey in the Indian rap scene. On the Edges and Sledges cricket podcast, Ashwin and Varun review the India vs. West Indies Test Series and the standout performances by Hanuma Vihari, Ishant Sharma and Jasprit Bumrah. On Tech Careers in the News, Shiladitya is joined by Sudarshan Rungta. He's a managing director at Accenture and he's in charge of the Oracle practice. They discuss Oracle's capability and impact in the real world. Thanks, and we hope to see you again soon.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.